Welcome to a special episode of the Long Take Review. The Long Take Review presents the Long TV Review. I'm your host, Jen Bankard, and I'm here with two fellow Star Wars fans. First, he's looked at history and realizes it's inevitable. It's PT McNiff. How's it going, PT?
Perhaps this is where a Ronin such as me belongs. Long live the podcast.
Wow. Okay.
I'm great, Jen. How are you?
Doing well. And he knows we're not following standard Jedi mission protocol. It's Greg Cass. How's it going, Greg?
The relationship between a podcaster and an apprentice is as challenging as it is meaningful. I'm good, Jen. How are you?
We matched, and you didn't even look at the Google Doc you said, so that was...
No. Sorry.
That was perfect. I have to say, I mostly picked it because I knew that you had gotten Hu Yang on the quiz that StarWars.com put out, so... We are here to review the first season of the latest Star Wars series, Ahsoka, which just finished on Disney+. And here's the thing. We don't normally cover TV on the show, but Greg and PT are two of the two friends that I have who love movies and love Star Wars with the same fervor. So there's no Venn diagram between the three of us, and we're just like one big circle.
Until Star Wars starts putting out movies again, we have to talk about the TV shows in a special insert episode.
That's true. And we are going to try to contextualize the series, at least at the end, sort of bring it back to the movies and kind of the lack of movies, Star Wars movies in theaters, and sort of like where does this plug into kind of the trajectory in the future as we know it. Greg and I have had the good fortune of appearing on other podcasts that are, dedicated to Star Wars. Greg's been on the Rebel Base Cards Breakfast Pack. I've been on Coffee with Kenobi. But PT hasn't had an outlet for his Star Wars takes and his Ahsoka takes. So we wanted to bring him into the mix and do a full season retrospective. So if you are listening to us for the first time, normally we'd try to do a spoiler-free section, but we're actually, for this series, going to do full spoilers from the get-go. So if you've not seen all of the Ahsoka series, there will be spoilers. There may actually be other spoilers for other Star Wars things along the way. We will try to do sort of ad hoc spoiler warnings if that comes up. Just be like, fast forward 30 seconds or something like that. So that's sort of what you're getting yourself into today. But first, I wanted to do a quick movie and maybe TV also. This confused me. News check-in. Do we want to start with the Star Wars news? There's some very sad Star Wars news, and then some also very fun Star Wars news.
I think start with the sad, and then we can
uplift. Okay,
yes,
that makes sense. So, I mean, Greg, actually, you're the one who's talked and written the most eloquently, I think, about this loss for the Star Wars community. The costume designer. So I'm gonna hand it off to you because I know you're gonna do a better job than I will.
Yeah, so this one hit me really hard. It was very sudden news last week. So there is a costume designer who has worked on almost all of the TV shows with some exceptions. And her name was Shauna Turpkic, I believe you pronounce it. It's TRPCIC. Apologies if I got it wrong. And I, had started to kind of marvel at how good the costumes were and had seen people passing around her posts. So I've maybe followed her on social media for about a year. And she was just an incredible talent and she was so enthusiastic about what she was doing. She posted pictures at a convention where she stopped on the floor and helped cosplayers repair their costumes. Whenever Disney would put the costumes out at a red carpet, she was there adjusting them and making sure they looked good on the mannequins, and went to Disneyland frequently just to go be like ecstatic that a costume she designed was now on a character in Galaxy's Edge, like popping out of a door and greeting people. And so had just incredible enthusiasm and seemed to be such an incredible talent. And they have not talked about exactly how she passed, what the circumstances were, but there was no clue whatsoever that something that she was ill. And it sounded like she was about to come to New York City Comic-Con this weekend and make an appearance. So it's very, very sad, and to see all the cast members and crew reach out and share their thoughts. But it's hard to I mean, Star Wars costumes disappear, and that's kind of the point of them. But if you think about from at least Mando season 2 forward, there's been some incredible work going on. I mean, we're talking about Ahsoka tonight. I would point to Balin and Shin have this incredible kind of layering of armor and cloth robes and so on. Ezra is wearing a chainmail shirt under his clothes that she had made and like hand forged. And so to do all of this and to, use the design work and do it's just incredible work. And I think she's already won an Emmy for some season along the way. And very sad that, she's not going to be a part of things moving forward. So obviously condolences to her family. And I hope Star Wars fans and everybody else take a little while and go learn about her career. I didn't learn till after she passed. She cut her teeth on Firefly. And I was like, there we go. There's some old school geek influence. So very exciting, very sad, but rest in peace, obviously.
And, just to add, I think that of all we're going to be getting into and talking about when we get to the rhetorical situation, the discourse around Star Wars in general, Ahsoka in particular, there are a lot of critiques that are out there. I feel like costumes have always been like all along been like, yes, this is really strong. I feel like the costumes and the music are kind of the unimpeachable elements of the craft of these shows that are just always strong and carried forward. And she was the standard bearer for these shows for the last few years. So it's really sad.
And if you think about, especially the season of Ahsoka, costumes are really a big part of the storytelling, right? Because without, especially Rosario Dawson's costumes, a lot of the story would be less explicit. I think we'll talk about that. But yeah, just like the costume changes, I think were very, very significant for several characters in this. And the other thing I'll say too is on social media, the main post that really got to me that I saw was from Jennifer Beals, who plays Garsa Fwip, and apparently just like was just gushing over how she had so many costumes and each one had so much attention to detail. But there was a cool story about how this costume designer basically told her to sort of incorporate things from her dreams into the character. And so they had apparently this whole back and forth about like, and things that she told her about dreams that she had actually made it into some of the embroidery and stuff like that. It's so cool. So yes, a huge loss for not only Star Wars, but just, the design community as well.
Throw in Ahmed Best, too. Remember when he came as Kelleran Beck and designed his robes to be Afrofuturism and designed kind of part of that? That all was through her as well. And one social media recommendation for people who want to celebrate her, look up the Mandalorian experience from Celebration Anaheim 2022. I know Jen and I got through it. I'm not sure you did, PT. You did?
I did.
And that was just a big room full of amazing costumes and props. And a lot of that was Shauna's work. So if people look up kind of all the different costumes there, you get views that, the shame of something like the embroidery you just mentioned, Jen, is it doesn't make it on camera, right? It's like it's there and you don't really know. And so to be able to see those costumes up close, you can see some really cool photos from people's trip through that exhibit.
My happier or kind of more fun Star Wars news that I just saw today. So I actually didn't do an extensive amount of reading. I didn't actually read. I just saw a bunch of headlines. But apparently Guillermo del Toro was working on a Jabba the Hutt movie. Did either of you see this?
I did.
Yeah.
It's happy and sad depending on whether people think that sounds like a good idea, because this is a movie that's not happening. But he was sort of in the early stages, pre-production, or at least pitching an idea, and he wanted to do the sort of rise of the gangster. And I think that there was a quote. And now I don't. It's one of those things where it's like it sounds so perfect, but also, am I sure he actually said it, or was it just on the internet? But like there was a quote from him saying, "There's only one character that I can see myself in, and it's Jabba the Hutt, because he's a very large man." But that he wanted to tell that story, and there's, something really interesting about a filmmaker of that stature and his approach to telling a story, where that could have been incredible. But apparently the deal is not the deal changing all the time. And this deal just fell apart.
I really like that he mentioned it offhandedly. Somebody had the tip and he said, I was thinking about something. It involved a character with a J and two B's. And then it has been every interview since then he gets asked about it. And he's just kind
Oh,
of
it's
giving
hilarious.
detail after detail. It's like, it's going to turn into Ewan talking about coming back as Obi-Wan Kenobi. And it's like, poor Guillermo can't do anything else. But, maybe the enthusiasm will have an effect on the power players and they can find a way to make it happen. Because I love him as a filmmaker. It would be interesting to see him within the constraints of kind of a PG-13 rated Star Wars movie in those regards.
Yeah, and I think it was one of those things where I never would have thought of him in connection with Star Wars, but the second I saw this, it made total sense because he does have such a love for monsters and monster movies. And I'd like to think that now this is circulating in the press that like there could be a push to make it happen. So that's why I'm choosing to be optimistic about it. But I think it would be so fun. Anything else new in the movie world or TV world, I guess, because we're also talking about TV.
Well, if we're talking the TV world, I will just note, because this wasn't on your list, that there was some little bit of information. There was an interview with Vince Gilligan that came out, who was the creator of Breaking Bad, co-creator of Better Call Saul. He's working on a new show, I believe, for Apple TV, that is unrelated to those, is not connected to Albuquerque, or at least not connected to that underworld of Albuquerque, but starring Ray Seahorn, who was Kim Wexler in Better Call Saul. And so not a lot of details about what exactly will happen in the show, but just the fact that it is progressing forward and they're hoping to film once the strikes are over got me very excited, because I like his filmmaking approach. And I assume a lot of his creative team, behind the scenes team, seems to like working with him and will go with him. So it will be, if nothing else, a beautifully shot show.
Nice. All right, I think we're ready to get into talking about Ahsoka, because that's what we came here to do. So I'm going to issue the spoiler warning again if you've not seen the entirety of the series, because we're going to be hopping back and forth talking about the whole show, all 8 episodes. So if you have not seen it yet and you do not want it spoiled, this is your last chance. All right, so for once we're going to do short takes, but with spoilers, if you want to. So what in general were both of your reactions? And I should say generally that all three of us are kind of more in the know than the average viewer of the show, right? Like we've seen all of Star Wars, we've seen all the animated shows. And we are going to talk later about audience members that are not coming with that context. But if you both want to kind of start with like what was your relationship to the show going into it, the character, or kind of anything like that, feel free to start with that.
Sure. I will say that I think, in contrast to maybe thoughts you'll hear momentarily, I really love the animated world, the sort of Filoni-verse that has been built up from the Clone Wars, especially Rebels. I kind of think of Rebels as certainly some of the best Star Wars that's out there. Some of my favorite Star Wars that's come out in the last, I mean, kind of forever, but especially sort of in the Disney era of things. So I was excited about this, but also trepidatious, because Rebels is important and I didn't want this to go badly. And I don't think it did go badly. I thought this went really well. This is maybe because of my biases of what I want from Star Wars, plus my built-in knowledge, which, as Jen said, we will talk about the burden or the benefit of having all of that. This was one of my favorite experiences of the live action shows within the Star Wars world. I mean, there's Andor, I kind of feel like is in a class of itself, but this is jostling, and I think currently right now, because of the parts that are in this that aren't in the other ones, is up there a little bit above the sort of the best seasons of The Mandalorian. So yeah, I loved it, and sort of I understand a lot of the critiques that are out there, but I'm borderline baffled at how much people don't like it. But that's part of being a Star Wars fan, I guess, in the year of our Lord 2023.
How about you, Greg?
You mean Grogu, the year of our Lord, Grogu?
I almost said Grogu, then I was like, is it Grogu? I mean, is it anyway?
Yeah. Well, I could pretend to be some other way, but I wrote a very long blog entry on ioncanon.com that really explained the moment before the series started that I was not that excited about this one. And the kind of hook for that blog entry was not my Star Wars, but making it okay to say not my Star Wars. Because I didn't mean this doesn't like become a part of my headcanon. I just meant that Star Wars has become so multifaceted. And there was a time when it was like, I love Star Wars and you loved everything in it. And then, it's not that anymore, right? Now there are so many places you can be a huge fan who only reads the comics or only watches the animated shows or what have you. So, my feelings on Clone Wars and Rebels, I was there from the start of both shows and I kind of watched each episode as it was new, day of or within that week. And I don't revisit them. I have fond memories. I enjoyed them. I don't think they're poor quality by any means, but it's just not the Star Wars that speaks the most to me. And I don't begrudge anybody who does love them. But I tripped on some of the things in Rebels that just felt too out there. And I'm saying this particularly because it connects with our later conversation. But things like the world between worlds, things like giant wolves that can teleport you across a planet. I was like, this is too weird for me. And the Clone Wars was more grounded, other than notably the Mortis arc, which now may prove to be the most important part of the Mortis arc, or maybe the Mortis arc and then the Yoda arc from the Lost Missions were kind of the most out there, kind of weird Clone Wars stuff. And I think they pushed just a little too far for my main taste, and I'm like, I don't really get this. I don't really like this. I also think Rebels suffered by being an early edition of there's another Jedi who's still alive for me, and we now know there have been like 20 of these dudes. So Order 66 was very haphazard at best.
That was just the beginning.
Yeah, so I think I held it harder against Rebels than I have more recent things because I've just come to accept it's a big galaxy, a lot escaped. All that being said, I thought this was a lot of fun. I really looked forward to it week to week. I thought some episodes were better than others, but I never regretted watching them. On the whole, I'm probably more in the like, this is like an 8.5 to me, but there were some episodes that I thought were 10s and they were really strong. It just didn't always hit those highs for me. But all of that I just said, like, yes, not for me, not for me. I did buy the $500 Ghost, so I'm not that high and mighty. So that's about where I'm sitting, and I'm really excited to unpack those feelings and talk to you all and hear about your enthusiasm. So Jen, where's your take on the whole season?
So for me going into this, Ahsoka is my favorite Star Wars character. And Rebels is one of my favorite Star Wars stories. And I think I'm the opposite of Greg, where the weirder it got from like, especially from sort of a fantasy kind of mysticism perspective, the more excited I would get. And I was like, wow, this really is sort of opening up what Star Wars can be for me. And so the fact that this series seems to double down on that made me very happy, but also confounded me a little bit. I was like, I can't believe, like, there were many moments in the show where I'm like, I cannot believe they're doing X. I can't, well, I guess we're in spoiler mode, so I can actually say what X is. Like, I can't believe the Purgles are appearing in multiple episodes, right? I can't believe, there's the Night Sisters are back and like doing crazy things, and I can't believe that we're ending on a statue of the father pointing in a particular direction on a planet we really have no idea what it is. So a lot of, I think, that kind of stuff was really exciting to me, and was something I think going into it I didn't really realize was on the table. And then it was in those first two episodes where, like, I think in terms of Ahsoka as a character and kind of like what this story was to be about, I was a little more skeptical. But all of the sort of like weird Star Wars mythology and the lore within the Star Wars universe, like, I could tell from the get-go that was going to be a big part of the series. And that to me, and I feel like it largely delivered on that. We're going to talk about like sort of at the end of the season was satisfying, but in terms of like an arc of a story, but I'd say that it was really satisfying from that perspective. Like, it gave us a lot to chew on. And then in terms of Ahsoka as a character, as I said, I was kind of skeptical at first. I was like, I'm not totally sure where this is going. But by episode 5, I was like, this is the greatest thing ever. And I feel like it did so much to help us understand her psychology as a character, especially during this period in the Star Wars timeline, and all the stuff with between her and Anakin, all the callbacks. I felt like all of the sort of callbacks to older stories, particularly Clone Wars, was not fan service. It was like actually the story itself, and to me that was really great. So in general, I'm very positive.
I just want to add to what you say. We're previewing some of the later segments. I think I agree with you that these connections weren't fan service; they were story, and I think that there are a lot of people who felt dissatisfied by the story because they wrote off the fan service. They wrote off the parts that are like, okay, this is just for people who like the other shows, and I'm not that person, so I don't care. And that they kind of switch their brains off sometimes, which doesn't mean that this is beyond reproach. We have plenty of criticisms to get into, but I think that is really important, that the story was sort of told through the continuation of themes and the continuation of characters and to some degree plot lines, which I think ended up being a little muddy for those who aren't already invested in it, which is potentially good for us because we're invested in it, but then it has to be recognized as maybe an issue in the show.
For sure. So I think we're already kind of dipping into the criticisms potentially, or just the sort of discourse surrounding the show and who is it for and all that sort of stuff. And we are going to get there. But before we get into that, because that has the potential to get very in the weeds in terms of critical, like sort of a critical view, I wanted to kind of just go through some of our highlights and start, we're all three of us are teachers. And I assume all of us sort of, when we give feedback to students, start with what's working well and what we really liked, and then kind of go into, Greg's shaking his head. I guess you don't, that's how we were trained, Greg.
Remove their hope and then build them back up. No, completely
no sandwich
agree.
Model. It's an open space sandwich for Greg.
I spent all day recording comments for student papers. And so every single time it was like, okay, what do I want to say about this one that's positive first? So I completely agree. It was just too easy a joke.
You have some interesting ideas here.
You record your comments?
Yes.
Like you do, like you do audio comments?
So much time. Yep, oh. I record a 5-minute voice memo to them instead of commenting on drafts. Highly, highly recommended, because they like it better too.
So this is how you're so good at podcasting. It's like you've had so much practice recording yourself. That's amazing. Shout out to Dan, our colleague at USC, who will never listen to this, but he's the only other person I know who does this consistently, and he also says it's great. So I just didn't know that you did that. So amazing. All right. We're getting sidetracked, but this is not a teaching podcast. So it can very easily turn into one. So I wanted to start with, just in general, what to you was like, what were the major highlights of this, or like, what do you feel like was working the best?
I'm going to start with Hayden. Look, I was in the movie theater for episode 5, and it totally worked and made it my favorite episode. And it was just so good. And look, Lucasfilm bought my love for the Kenobi series by letting us go to the world premiere, and it bought my love by sending me to the theater for this episode. I'm not going to say I don't see that working on me in both cases, but it was just so incredible, and I am here for the Hayden Redemption Tour. Since we haven't talked a lot of Star Wars on this, I will say I'm not the biggest prequel fan, but I'm not at all a prequel hater. I see their flaws. I think they're silly at times, but I have never been somebody who thought my childhood was ruined or anything like that. So to see Hayden, the actor, get some redemption and get to be kind of part of this fold and actually kind of show off his acting was huge to me. And we got a good taste of it in Kenobi, but I thought he was better here than he was in Kenobi. And that's partially what they asked him to do and how he got to do it. But they released just a little behind the scenes shot that showed him kind of workshopping the character with Dave. And I was like, there it is. Yes. There's my Life is a Glass House guy, or whatever that other movie he did with Shattered Glass. No, I don't remember. But
Life is a House in Shattered Glass. I appreciate your pushing for the crossover, though. Life in a Glass
It,
House, which is the
yeah,
Radiohead song, of course.
Life in a Glass House is the cinematic universe name. You all are just behind. So it's like, he got hired for a reason, and then George Lucas. I mean, we know this from Natalie Portman, right? Natalie Portman's a great actress, but she's not great in the prequel movies, and so I'm here for the Hayden redemption story. That was by far the highlight for me across these episodes.
I hear you on that, and I agree. I think that there's a lot to be said, not only for, I mean, there is sort of this cycle that happens in Star Wars fandom, and for those of you who have not already read it, please go to ioncanon.com, read that post from Greg about the Not My Star Wars thing, because I think it's such a fundamental truth of sort of how we cycle through Star Wars. And there is this sort of new things are bad, and then after a time it's like, actually we liked that, and they get brought back in. So it is time. Ahmed Best has come back, Hayden's come back, but I think that Hayden has really shown that he's got the goods, and he was doing a lot of good here. So I do see that, and to agree with Greg in the context of sort of the feeling of the prequels, I definitely openly admit that I'm more on the fanboy side, because when the prequels came out, I was like, well, this is more Star Wars, and that's what I wanted. And it was like, all these things are bad, and it's just like, yeah, you're right. But you know what? Like, I'm still going to go see this a ton of times because it's Star Wars and I want to know this story and I want to see it. And now that we have like Star Wars coming multiple times a year, it's maybe not that same level of I got to, it clears the threshold for by just merely existing. But, I think that the prequels have a lot of rich concepts and ideas that are not necessarily executed all that well, or executed to the best of the ability, given the time limits and the technology limits, and the maybe filmmaking approach limits that were there at the time. I never had any like hatred towards Hayden, but I am very glad that he is back, and I partially lay all that groundwork to say that one of the things I really liked about this show was its subtlety. And I don't know if it was always successful in its subtlety, but I do think it was doing its best sort of show the dynamics between these characters and the advancement and the growth and the arc of these characters without kind of banging you over the head with it, which I laid all that prequel love down to say is in contrast to a lot of things that happen in the prequels, where there are a lot of scenes where two people are talking about, well, this is how I'm feeling right now, and this is how I'm feeling right now. And then there's things that are subtle that get lost, I think, in the prequels, but 80% of the motivations and movements are spelled out in dialogue scenes in those movies. And I think this did a good job of not doing that. I think a good job, but maybe it was too subtle at times. Again, something to get into and discuss. But I like that subtlety. And along with that, as sort of mentioned or referenced earlier, another aspect I love was just sort of, it gave us another wing of this galaxy or galaxies now to explore, which we sort of have the scum and villainy side in The Mandalorian. We have the sort of fight against oppression, fascism, rebellion side in Andor. And sort of on the ground stuff, and this is the mysticism, the force, dealing with the more magical concepts of it. And I love that. I love having that. And again, unlike Greg, who hates Rebels, I'm with Jen, who I'm just joking. I'm kidding. All that sort of weirdness. I like that it leaned into that. I like that it's opening the door and giving us that corner of this fictional universe.
Yeah,
and sorry, Jen, I'll also say best space battles I think that we've seen since Rogue One. I'm sorry your answer.
No. That's sort of what I was going to say, because what I was going to say is I think this series does a really good job of balancing classic things that we expect from Star Wars. I feel like some of the lightsaber battles in this are among the best I've ever seen, especially from like a fight choreography perspective. Like, I was just rewatching the one from the finale, and Diana Inosanto and Rosario Dawson are like going at it, and it's just incredible to watch. And it's just like, just from a pure like sort of physical perspective, like in terms of their sort of the athletics of it, I feel like so many of the fights in this are really incredible. And then you have like great callbacks to sort of like classic Star Wars space fights, but then also I feel like this series pushes Star Wars in new directions, right? Like, I think in my reviews, if I look back at all my reviews all season, I talked way more about fantasy literature than I ever would have for any other Star Wars series, right? Like I was
Mm.
like, oh, and this week we had there's some things from Miyazaki I can see. This week there's Tolkien. This week there's Narnia, right? Like, and I feel like I never really would have made those direct comparisons to other Star Wars stories, and so I feel like in that sense it really feels really fresh. In the same way that Andor, people were like, wow, for once a Star Wars story that's not obsessed with Jedi. This is the opposite of that, where it's like really like it's like all it's obsessed with is the Force and Jedi, right? And what does that mean? So to me, I thought it struck a really good balance between all those things, and a lot of the complaints that people have, I feel like if we satisfied what people were asking for, that would take away inevitably from a lot of the amazing action that we got. And I feel like Star Wars has to have both. Like it has to have the epic moments, the story, the conversations that kind of live on forever, but then also these iconic action scenes. So in that sense I was really happy. Yeah, and just like introducing new possibilities. That's the other thing. The idea that we I mean, it's just from the jump in the first couple episodes, the idea that there's a whole other galaxy. There were so many things in this that were really game changing to Star Wars in ways that I feel like we don't even fully understand. And so yeah, so I really, all that stuff to me was super exciting. How about Greg? Why don't you pick? Because I have a bunch of favorite fill in the blank. We're not going to get to all of them. Do you have one that you want to talk about?
I'm tempted by the one where you just put your cursor, but I want to go. I'll say favorite line or exchange, but maybe take that like all the time the characters kind of branched off in little pairs and went and go had either some action or some dialogue as a part of this. So I'll maybe ask like kind of favorite scene in that regard, like when two characters went and had a little exchange. And there are a few candidates for mine. Now I'm unsure of my answer. I'm gonna give it to Balin and Ahsoka in episode 4 when they were dueling at the kind of weird henge that they were at. I think, it's always with a tinge of sadness that I mention Ray Stevenson's Balin, because it was an incredible performance, and it's just another tragedy that we've lost him at such an early age. And especially, my big question all season was, did they land that plot line? I didn't necessarily want him dead, but I was like, I'm scared of what happens if we don't get him back. And I think that's a really hard question now for the future seasons, because I think, I don't want it to be Poochie went home to his own galaxy, but I also think it can be really hard for anybody to live up to that performance. The joke I made on Rebel Base Card is Clancy Brown is right there, and you wasted him on his cameo when he could deliver on a Balin. And if people go out and see, because this is a movie podcast, go see Dumb Money, and there's a very small Clancy Brown, but a very great Clancy Brown does a Massachusetts accent part, which I really encourage people to enjoy. So I will say that scene was pretty incredible to me. And my main critique of the finale is they sidelined him and Shin, which to me were these two mercenary fallen Jedi antagonists were phenomenal. And all my questions all season long was, where is this plot line going? And the finale said, tune in next year or 3 years from now with the writer's strike, when Dave Filoni has to hire a writer's room now and can't just write this himself and so on. So like, it's going to take some time. And that was a little disappointing to me. So I will take that as my favorite kind of two characters laying it out, talking some truth to each other.
I mean, yeah, Balin is just like A+ taunting, no notes. It's just he was so good at antagonizing any character that he was with. I think, and just like holding, even with like Thrawn, like holding his own really and stuff like that. So yeah, I agree with Ray, because I think this is a good time probably just to talk about the Ray Stevenson factor. And I think I would have been much easier had he been bad. which sounds weird, but you know what I mean? Like, it would have been easier to be like, oh, it's unfortunate he died, but like, we're fine. You know what I mean? Like, in terms of not humanity is fine, but because he's a person, but like, I'm sure, and from all accounts, was a lovely person, but you know, in terms of like the production of the series, that would have been a little bit easier. But I do think they have to recast him. I think, because to me, where we leave off clearly indicates that he has so much story to go. He's only just getting started in terms of what the journey his character's on. I doubt they would have written it that way and been like, oh, sure, no problem. We can just like not tell that story. You know what I mean?
Someone's going to have to do the thing that he was going to do, that Balin was going to play, the role Balin was going to play in this story. And, you know, theoretically, they could just be like, and now someone else is doing it. Or, you know, the good guys find whatever he was looking for. And we find out something happened to him and whatever. But yeah, it was, his performance was so good. The character was so intriguing. I think you could argue mostly because his performance was so good.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there were a lot of sort of hints at dimensions in the character, and sort of, you know, him making, I think one of the things that really stood out was him sort of commenting, almost meta commenting on Star Wars, is like, these stories just happen over and over again, and we got to break it. Like, we got to find a new thing besides Jedi versus Sith, Rebel versus Empire. You know, we're stuck, and I got to break the wheel and go from there. And I think a lot of people who are starved for Star Wars to do something else were ready for that to happen. And I think that if Ray Stevenson were fine in a better timeline, and he was A-okay and ready to go for a second season, there still would have been a little bit of, oh man, like, we got to wait till next time to find out where that goes. But I think the fact that the season started, the first episode's dedicated to him, we already know he was gone, I think really put a lot of weight on like, what is going to happen here? We're so intrigued. We're maybe the most intrigued by this. This is the biggest mystery. Everyone else was kind of a known factor if you follow all these things. These people are new. What are they going to do? Also, we only have 8 episodes to do that. And then it ends with a very clear, this wasn't going to be a story that was going to be told in 8 episodes. And I think that it hurt more because it's like, oh God, like, so wait, someone else or a different character, a different actor playing this character. So, you know, I think that the circumstances made that feel worse than it might have otherwise. But I do think it would have been a bump for almost everyone that like, we didn't get 20 minutes of the finale about what Balin is up to. We got a 40-second silent shot that was incredible, but, you know, only hinted at what might be happening, not more explanation, and certainly nothing approaching closure.
For sure. Yeah. And I think I've also seen, but it's going to be a rough road from here on out with him, because that character, because I've seen some really bad fan casting, really bad. Like, I love George Clooney, but he cannot play Balin Skull. I don't know whoever posted that on the internet. They were like, it's because of the basically. Anyway, I'll send it to you. I don't know. I don't remember where I saw it, but I was just like, are you serious? So basically, the internet has decided anyone with a salt and pepper beard is an automatic candidate for Balin Skull, and like, that's just the wrong approach to be taking to this unfortunate process that we're not on. But yeah, I agree with your thing about it being extra mystery, like a meta mystery in addition to a mystery in the story, and that compounded kind of our need to know. Because for me, I was definitely in suspense, being like, is he going to just neatly? Was his character always going to die off, and then we don't have to sort of worry about what's going to happen next? And again, in some ways, that would, not that I wanted that character to die at all. He's super interesting, but it almost would have been easier, right? To be like, well, his character's gone anyway, problem solved. So I don't know. I really do think they have to recast him. Or like, I guess, like, if we're engineering the plot going forward, the only other candidate I can think of is PT mentioned earlier, like, what other character could take over whatever he was going to do? I mean, Shin's the only one I can think of, right?
It would be a very different vibe. It would be a very different thing, but maybe it could work.
Yeah.
The only other option I see is like, the character goes off and does his thing, and everybody else is just chasing him. And we maybe actually never get to see what he did, but they're all following the footsteps and the mystery of it.
Right. And then we find he dies off screen. He dies off screen, and then we find sort of like bits and pieces, like like not literally his journal, but like basically the equivalent of like if we found his journal being like, here's what I did today in the cave, and like here's what I found. You know what I mean? So that could work. I could see that.
It's like,
and then it's very much like his absence is still felt, but like in the story, he's not gone, sort of thing.
It's sort of like BioShock with the big bad guy that you never actually catch up to, but you start to you get little snippets of stuff that he did. I just wanted to note that both Rebel Base Card and Coffee with Kenobi, the two podcasts that my co-hosts were on, discourage irresponsible speculation, and I feel like this could be a safe haven for some irresponsible speculation at the end of the season.
That was extremely challenging for me. Like
we are
because if you've read any of my reviews, I don't care. I fully speculate. I go like wild conjectures, and it's very therapeutic for me and excited and fun. And to be like, oh wait, anytime anything I was saying approach speculation, I had to stop talking about it. Was like very challenging. So I'm glad that we can do that. So yeah, yeah, it's hard to say, and like they have a lot of time to figure it out, obviously. Since we are nominally or supposed to be a movie podcast, first and foremost, are there big recasts of actors from film that we can think of as sort of like a good model, like that worked really well? My mind sort of goes to Dumbledore. I feel like that mostly was
another
fine.
sad moment to be talking about that recasting.
Oh, it's true, because now
that's Michael Gambon, but that's where
right.
my mind went too, because he was phenomenal in that part, and I will say much better, all due respect, much better than Richard Harris, who didn't get the twinkle, but Michael Gambon got the twinkle of Dumbledore.
The other one that jumps to mind, even though it's a show I've actually never watched, but the people who love it really love it, was the Spartacus show that I think was on Stars or Cinemax or Showtime. And the star of that show, like, I think very quickly got sick and died, and was obviously, if you picture Spartacus, was in shape, prime of his life, like was around like 30 years old, and had some tragedy befall him. And they did like 2 or 3 more seasons with just somebody else. And there's always that discussion of didn't quite capture the same thing, or actually I liked his version had more nuance. There's debate about it, but it is something that's happened. I think that it's just really tough here because across the board, whatever people's reactions were, I think, to this show, everyone loved Balin. And everyone was like intrigued by what the promise of what he was doing. And I do think it was Stevenson's performance that drove it more than anything else. So, there's qualities that he has that I'm sure other actors could attempt to emulate, but are they going to be able to get that essence in, especially when they have the sort of more difficult task of concretizing these abstract concepts that Stevenson got to muse on in the role, when suddenly it's just sort of like, it's not just I'm searching for a power. It's like, this power is this person, like, or this god that's over here, which already might bump, people would might like I don't know about that. And then to have that, it's going to be a tough task. And I don't know who will be willing to do it, or who will be good at it.
I don't envy whoever does step into that role if they do recast, for sure, because they're just going to get a lot of like, well, you're not as good, right? No matter what, no matter how good they are, I think. But as a counterexample, I would say the alternative is Black Panther, right, with the loss of Chadwick Boseman. And I'd say that like the refusal to recast is very respectful, and I totally understand it. But now that I've seen Wakanda Forever, I'm like, maybe we should have just recast Chadwick Boseman because it's the loss of the character. How much greater is the loss of the character versus preserving the actor's sort of stake in that character? And I feel like if the actor elevated the character that much, don't we want to see that character carry on in some way, right? So, and I wouldn't have necessarily said that before Wakanda Forever came out. And I liked Wakanda Forever as a movie a lot. Don't get me wrong. But I feel like the awkwardness of like, trying to sort of force the mantle onto this other character that was never really intended to have it. It was Shuri, right? Like, I guess spoilers for Wakanda Forever. Sorry.
Wow.
A movie that's been out for a really long time. So I don't feel super bad about that. But
almost,
but you know what I mean? Like,
almost.
And I love the character of Shuri, but like, do I want Shuri to be Black Panther? Not simply because we don't want to recast T'Challa. I don't know. It's hard. So
And I'll throw out two more. What came to mind when you asked the question about movies recasting, I thought of The Matrix with the Oracle, who was a fantastic part of that first movie, and then the actress
oh
passed away, I
yeah,
believe, between the second and the third. Now, that mythology gave them a way to kind of hand wave it, and I think she says something like, "I've been through a lot since we last met, and my appearance sometimes changes." And I that's kind of almost my theory. Like, you could kind of yada yada a way that it could work
right.
within this mythology or something,
Well, that's
but
true.
it's a little harder than that. I mean, the Matrix
Right.
is good that
If
way.
he has some
Um,
crazy life changing DNA reorganizing Doctor Who esque
yeah,
mystical experience, and then comes out as another
sure.
actor, I'd be mostly okay
Um,
with that. I guess it'd be kind of hokey,
so
but
then I was also going to note you brought up
Okay, in
Marvel.
Star Wars?
You brought up
Sorry.
Marvel. Don't forget Rhodey, right?
yeah,
We went from Terrence. Why am I forgetting his last name?
Howard,
Howard.
Terrence Howard.
Terrence Howard to Don Cheadle, and no explanation on it. It's all kind of shady. Whatever happened behind the scenes. Sounds like maybe he wanted more money, but seemed kind of reasonable. But maybe he was a jerk to work with. They're kind of vague.
I think it
The
was in a
one that,
negotiation fell apart. Is my understanding.
yeah, the one that stands out to me is I am also on a Wheel of Time podcast, and about 2/3 of the way through the first season of Wheel of Time, the actors are going through a kind of portally thing, and one character is like a little behind, and they're like, "It's closing, go!" and he doesn't make it in. And I was confused because I was like, "That doesn't happen in the book. Why'd they leave Matt behind?" And my co-host said, "Oh, that actor quit during COVID, so he's just gone." And so the character disappeared for a quarter of the season when the character would have been present in the books, and apparently
Mm,
now that the second season is out, they just found a new guy who looks vaguely like him. So yeah, these things happen, and it's a shame in these circumstances, but um, passing it all to Shin Hati feels a little like making Shuri Black Panther in some regards. So finding a
right,
way to
right.
still let that character have
Because
the arc.
she's so interesting in her own right, right? Like, and I think it
Mm,
works both ways. If we suddenly made her fulfill whatever Balin's destiny was supposed to be, then that takes away from what her character was doing. And as we learned at the end of the season, they're both out for very different things.
mm,
Right?
mm.
So they're on different paths, and so to suddenly swap them, yeah, would be really weird. Um, but can we, since we spent so much time about talking about Ray Stevenson and Balin, like, can we pinpoint? Because I always do this with my students. I'm like, be more specific about why this is, right? So, like, why is he so good, and why is Balin so interesting?
I think he's so good. The character is so good because he doesn't have the clear motivation or side. Like the mystery, I think really helped, where it was like from the very beginning, it was like, I'm here to rescue this bad guy, the quote unquote bad guy of Morgan Elsbeth, who's in a prison, who Ahsoka fought, is aligned with Thrawn, et cetera, et cetera. If you've watched The Mandalorian, if you have this vested interest already in these characters, you already know, this person's bad. But then it's like he's immediately like, I'm doing this for money. Like his first line almost is just like, you pay me enough, I'll do this. And whatever he's talking, it's this like, I'm actually after something else. There's power, but it's not the kind of power we're used to. And then that's all super intriguing. Like you said, he's got the taunts whenever he's poking at someone, one of the good, one of the, our heroes, or even one of the people he's working with. There's those details of just kind of like, I don't know this guy. Like he's not the bad guy. Like the bad guys are usually the bad guys. The good guys are usually the good guys. Maybe there's a big switch from one to the other, but there's not a lot of this sort of, I'm kind of off doing my own thing and maybe in like a different narrative conversation about what I want to do. And so I think that there is, again, I sort of said this earlier, maybe I think there's a thirst for Star Wars to break out of the bonds of
Mm,
what it has been. And I think that, that's one of the reasons people really loved Andor, because it was, the fact that one of the knocks on Andor was this could not be Star Wars. This could be anything else apart from a few bits of iconography. And, but people are like, no, that's good. I like that. I want that kind of a story. I don't want another Skywalker involved. I don't want to be in between the margins of, what's happening here. And his whole thing was, I also want that. I also want to tell a story that isn't doing it. And, it's speculation, but we're speculating irresponsibly on here. But, I will note that one of the things people were saying is maybe all the stuff that Balin's doing in this other galaxy is stirring up what's going to become the narrative antagonist for the movies that are going to be set after the Skywalker saga. So when they do a movie that brings back Daisy Ridley as Rey, that's going to be set 10 years or so after episode 9, that it won't be episode 10. It's going to be, not the Skywalker saga. It's, this galaxy against another galaxy with whatever this thing is coming in. So he's striving towards a new Star Wars story. And I think that people responded to that.
Which is interesting because I feel like going into the series, I thought Ahsoka could fill that role because her most famous line is, "I am no Jedi," right? But then in live action, there seems to be either backtracking of that or reframing of that in some way. I still don't really actually know what's going on with that, right? Is like, did she change her mind? I think I've heard the explanation of like, this is the only life she knows, so she's sort of reverted back to it, and so that's why she's sort of like self-identifying as a Jedi or everyone else. But my theory was like, well, that's what everyone else is calling her. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what she would call herself, I guess. But there hasn't really been a moment where she's clearing that up. So I don't know. But do either of you have thoughts about that? Is like Ahsoka as Grey Jedi doesn't seem to be really panning out, but Balin's sort of taking on that role instead.
What I'll say to that is, one, I do think Filoni is a student of Lucas, and I think that but I would guess that both of them are in alignment that the Jedi don't have to be the light side force. Like the light side of the force isn't just Jedi, but the light side is better than the dark side. So Gray is actually not good. Like Gray isn't like, Gray isn't some sort of compromise. Like Gray is just on the path to being bad. And so, there is sort of like a positive thing you can do or a negative thing you can do in a given context, and you should try to do the positive thing. So, I think that it matters she's not a Jedi. I think that the fact that the Gray Jedi is an antagonist is an intentional choice and an intriguing one. And again, part of the reason why folks are like, I want to know more about this. I'm intrigued. But I think ultimately it's not going to be, he's right, that like, we should maybe eschew some of the positive things. The answer is in between the two extremes. We balance it up and divide it by two. I will say in terms of the I am no Jedi, one of the answers, not to sort of bring it all the way back around, one of my two answers to the like, what's your favorite line? And to reframe it around Greg's thing, I would choose the Ahsoka Huang exchanges. And one of those was when, Huang is talking about like, Sabine, like, not going to be a Jedi, can't do all this stuff. And Ahsoka says, I don't need her to be a Jedi. I need her to be herself. And that like was to me the sort of only nod to a clear understanding of like, the Jedi is just like a card you get or like a little emblem you can put. It's a job. It's not like who you are. And, being who you are and being yourself can still be embracing the Force, embracing the light side, but bringing in all the contradictory aspects of yourself, such as being a Mandalorian and being a Jedi. And for Ahsoka, it's having lived her whole life training as a Jedi, but also having walked away from the Jedi. So she's both Jedi and not Jedi, which isn't the same as the quote unquote Gray Jedi, which is more about light versus dark.
I want to agree with all that and build a little bit on it because I was really thinking about the arc that PT just described for Sabine, which I would say is the arc she went on, right? She decided for herself, I don't want to be a Jedi, I want to be myself. And I thought that was all affirmed in the final battles where Ahsoka was just like, Sabine, blasters, and she switches over and just does it. And it's like, that's who Ahsoka wants her to be. Yes, use the lightsaber, but use your blasters. Like, be yourself. I don't think Ahsoka was present for the move where she pretended to do a force push, but then it was her wrist rockets. But it's like, yeah, that's what you should be. Like, be that. Like take care of yourself.
And that's the anti-Luke and Grogu stance, right?
Yes,
because
yes,
Luke would be like either
nice
or. You can't. You have to disavow one or the other. Sorry, go ahead.
And I think Ahsoka's arc is to me the same thing. I would say Ahsoka at the beginning of the series is, and I don't think this is in the text, this is me reading the context. She's afraid of the title Jedi, right? Like, she wouldn't say I am a Jedi because she sees the legacy of the Jedi. It's very much Luke in Last Jedi, right? The legacy of the Jedi is failure, and she sees that. And to PT's point from a long time ago of like, people didn't get her arc. There were people who were like, this performance sucks. It's like they were making very specific choices at the beginning of this where she was not being herself. She was being a reserved and standoffish because she was afraid. And I think that fear is failure with Sabine, right? That she thought she almost raised a Sith, 5 years ago or so, and stopped herself from doing that. And it's fear of the fact that the most influential figure in her life became effing Space Hitler, right? And like, yeah, maybe let's slow our roll and identify what went wrong there so we can think about it. And I think that worked so well in this series. And I didn't pick this one. I don't know if it was on your list, but like, whose arc was your favorite? Mine was Ahsoka. I liked a lot of the characters, and I liked a lot of what we saw, but like, the people out there being like, this was dumb, it didn't teach us anything about Ahsoka, like, weren't paying attention to the text, because this was a story about looking at yourself, ridding yourself of the kind of legacy and the shadow of failure and your masters and all of that, and just affirming yourself for who you are and being yourself and doing it, choosing for yourself what matters to you. You know what matters to me? My master always had my back, and I've got your back from now on. That's a huge affirmation in the finale. And people are like, well, the spaceship was moving kind of slow, so that conversation was kind of dumb. Like, I thought they were supposed to be rushing. And it's like, just like, forget all that silly nonsense and look at these beautiful character bits we're getting, because I think that's where the power of the show really was for me.
And
so.
our toxic normie discourse returns to the podcast.
No, I want to make it very clear. This is toxic nerd discourse. This is hardcore nerds who are being toxic about it. And I'll just add to Greg's point, a callback to it, my earlier point, which is I think that a lot of what you're saying, Greg, came through in conjunction with some of the fan service moments. And I think that because people were writing off the fan service, or writing off those sort of callbacks, especially her dynamic with Anakin, as just fan service, they missed it and they didn't see what was happening.
Well, it's also like, if you think about it, the arc that Greg is describing, which I'm so happy to hear that, because a lot of when I was writing my reviews throughout the season, I was like, am I the only one who sees this? Or like, is this just me reading too much into it because I love the character so much, or whatever it is? And I feel like a lot of the arc you're talking about, understanding the arc, hinges on that episode 5. And episode 5 is the most surreal and kind of weird especially in terms of the editing. People are still actually arguing about where the characters were, right? Whether or not they were actually in the world between worlds, or if it was like some fever dream that Ahsoka had while she was drowning, right? So I feel like because so much of that episode is like not concrete and kind of easy to wrap your head around, I think that's probably where the divide goes. Because if you don't buy into what's happening in that episode and why we are seeing the things that we're seeing in that episode, I feel like the arc probably feels incomplete, because you didn't understand what the pivot point was.
Yeah, I will say to bring it to normie discourse and maybe normie reactions is, I talked to some friends who have only watched live action. They don't watch the animated stuff. So they've only seen Ahsoka in The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett. And they were a little bit like, she was cool. I don't know why I was supposed to root for her, like, during the course of this. Like, cool, like, all of this was fine. Like, clearly it was designed for me to do that, but I wasn't really emotionally invested just because, I was only emotionally invested because she's clearly the hero and the main character and, fighting for everyone else, blah, blah, blah. But like, I didn't particularly care about her as a character, or Ezra was the other. Like, they kind of saw like Sabine as the person that was like the most sort of clear cut protagonist to glom onto. And that's a potential. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself on the sheet, but that's a potential just fatal flaw of this show. If should it be able to stand on its own, and is it possible that people could glom onto all of this without the foreknowledge of what came before?
PT's
So-
wrong about everything there.
Mm,
Not
good.
really, but I want to not always start my comments with like, yes, PT is wise, so I have to continue. But essentially, yes, PT is wise, so I want to continue. Here's what I would say about that. People have been trained on 40 years of Star Wars to say, look at the young characters starting out their journey and becoming great. And that is why I think so many of us latched onto Sabine, because what has almost each of the trilogies, all of these hinge on somebody getting the call to adventure and starting. And that's the Sabine arc in this episode. But I think there's a reason the show's called Ahsoka and not just like Sabine Happy Jedi Hour, right? And to me, this is a new kind of Star Wars, and it's Star Wars meditating on being the mentor, being that side of this important dyad that, oh, sorry, I shouldn't say that, this important pairing that happens.
That's a
I
loaded
go back.
word, Greg.
Yeah, I go back to before the season began, they put out a little clip that was called like Masters and Apprentices and talked about all the pairs. And the line I picked at the beginning was because I did want to give Hu Yang a shout out. But that's the thesis of the show to me, right? Like the relationship between a teacher and a student is as challenging as it is meaningful. Like that's my daily life, right? I love my job
Yes.
and I love what I do, but it's not a walk in the park and it's not easy to reach all students. And I see a direct connection between Dave Filoni on the set of Last Jedi, watching Rian Johnson, thinking about Rian Johnson's script and what he's trying to do here and putting that together. And so my other favorite moment in the series might be like when Ahsoka in episode 7 is training and at the very end she just says with like this heavy sigh like, he was a good master. And it's like she had never been able to say that to herself. And that's a revelation. And it's what frees her to say, I'm just going to be a good master. And that's all we can do, right? That's all I can do in my daily job. Do my best to be the teacher my students need. And I'll call it that. But, I think that is not a story Star Wars has told before. And that makes me excited. And I know we're going to tackle this question. So I'll let Jen segue to any one of the like 5 bits of content we've planned that we've now referenced obliquely.
I know, right? I guess, are we ready to go to the rhetorical situation? All right. So because we've already been talking about this whole time. So
Jen, heavy sigh. All right.
Be the mentor
Well,
PT and I need.
I did. Well, so I did. As peek behind the curtain, listeners, I did in our original structure of this episode, I had written, maybe we should start with the rhetorical situation since so much of the discourse around the show kind of connects to it. And then I was like, but maybe we should be positive. And right. And then and so we switched it up. So now it's like I think my original instinct was correct. And we should have just put it out there at the get-go and then filtered in.
I appreciate that you think the hour and 4-minute mark is not still the beginning of the episode.
Oh, that's true. It's only, like Balin says, it's only the beginning, right? Or like, I got that wrong, but he says something about the beginning. He has a big moment where he talks about we're looking for the beginning. All right, so now we're going to move to the rhetorical situation, a segment in which we look at, in this case, a television series through the lens of our academic experience. I looked up too soon and I just see you conducting. I think that's first. So in the teaching of writing, the rhetorical situation, it's not our phrase, it's a pre-existing one, refers to any contextual factors that influence composing and interpretation. And I feel like that's all we've been talking about this episode so far, is all these sort of contextual factors that are kind of playing into people's reactions and how they're receiving the show. So my question kind of to get us started is, how are people's definitions of what Star Wars is? Because this is a great question that Greg brought up of like, what's the sort of sweet spot between something new, but also how new can something be while still also being Star Wars? How does people's different definitions of Star Wars and kind of their values that they see in the Star Wars franchise, how does that sort of change the way they're reacting and engaging with this show, do you think?
So I originally asked this question on a podcast I was a guest star on, I think the week before Rogue One. And so I want to put that context out there because it was like we were about to get a spin-off movie and we had some clues by then. We'd certainly seen a lot of trailers, but didn't really know. And kind of the core question became, like, if you're taking a story out of the Star Wars saga, what does it still need to count as Star Wars? And it's so interesting to me now that we've stretched that like incredibly far. And I think where discourse kind of starts getting into fights is when something is too new or too different for someone's taste versus still within it. I'm going to give my personal definition, and I think this works, but we'll see. I have become somebody in maybe the last 5 to 10 years where that's a little much, maybe the last 5 years, where I want to be challenged by my art. If I go see a movie or I watch a show, which I do from time to time, not all that often, or read a book, I just can't anymore handle the, hey, remember this? Here's this. And it just becomes really bitter in my mouth now, that kind of sweet fan servicey things. And I did not feel that often in this show. I think PT nailed it earlier when some people say that's what these Rebels characters were, but that's not what these Rebels characters were. To me, that's when somebody says a line the exact same way. And, you know, there's a lot of Star Wars fandom that's like, I can point to that thing and say that's a thing. So one of my very good Star Wars friends hated Andor. And I could not have loved Andor more. And it's like, I needed everything about Andor was exactly what I needed Star Wars to be. It was just this little bit of familiar, just this context that mattered to me. And yet it told something so much bigger than Star Wars. And it was so important to me that all of that could come together and tell this incredible story. And that same friend is like through the moon excited about Ahsoka compared to me. I think because it's like, oh, this like takes me back to my childhood and it gives me that feeling of wonder and amazement. And I even though expressing it from my point of view necessarily biases it towards me, but I really think that there's like a genuine way in which both of those reactions are what Star Wars fans demand. And we're all kind of sliding between those scales. So Star Wars will always need to have something that lets you be like, yes, that's what made me happy when I was 10 years old. But I think it's only going to survive the more it pushes that definition outward and continues to challenge us. And, you know, it's clear I loved Last Jedi. That's my jam of the Disney era. And it challenged the heck out of me. I didn't leave that theater being like, this was the best. Like, it took me a week of processing it and really thinking about it, and like 8 screenings that week to figure out what my feelings really were. And then I came to appreciate kind of all it was doing. So that's my answer. If Star Wars is going to continue, it has to challenge us. If it doesn't kind of scratch that nostalgia itch, though, I think that's where it runs into some trouble.
Greg, did the A-list exist, the program, when The Last Jedi came out, or did you pay individually for each of those 8 screenings?
I think I paid for that. Rise of Skywalker, I think, is my earliest.
Of course
A-list.
you did.
Yeah.
Bless you. I mean, as you should have. This is a pro Last Jedi podcast, if that hasn't become clear. That's an amazing answer. And I will add on to that before, I guess, what I wanted to say to Jen's question. I'll add on that I do think world events, particularly national events, in the last half decade plus, have really kind of changed what nostalgia means and how nostalgia hits. And part of that is just that, you know, we started getting about a decade ago a lot of the like, remember the 80s? Like this thing from the 80s. Like, what about that? And it's just like, yes, I did grow up in the 80s. What a great point. That is really good. I did like all of those things. And, you know, inevitably just the impact gets lower and lower. The more hits you take, the less high you're going to get. So that happens. And then there's also this sort of, looking back to a better time, like doesn't feel so fun anymore. And I think that that is something that has I think created a similar drive as Greg's, where it's like, if it's just like, check out this, remember this? Wasn't this fun? Let's do it again. I can get sucked up into it and I can like it, but I'm not going to think about it again. And I'm not going to really want to go back to it. I think that there's something around the curse of what Star Wars is and where it exists right now, where I think, as we sort of been talking about, I do think there were ways in which this show was pushing into like, what other stories could we tell? I think there are people who have negative reaction to it who are like, I don't want zombies. Like, zombies is not like that. This is, ghosts were fine. Right. Zombies are weird. That doesn't fit into Star Wars. And if we're getting the hint at the end of the season, the parallel to the Darksaber at the end of Mandalorian season 1, which was planting a seed that we're gonna have to care about this thing for a few years in that show, were the Mortis gods. Like, the people who don't watch the animated shows are gonna be like, what is happening? So like, it's going to get weird. It's pushing that expansion, but because there's so much Star Wars that exists, and because the way that Dave Filoni approaches this is, I want to push, I want to expand, but whenever I'm like, oh, I want to go and do something, why don't I tie it into a thing from a book, or a thing, now at this point, a thing from one of my earlier shows? There becomes this feeling that even when it is pushing and doing something different, it's just more Star Wars, because it's like, yeah, we're going to have weird Force gods that, like, who knows what Balin is going to try to do with them, but it's also just a thing from the Clone Wars. And I think that the people who are tuned in enough to be aware that, like, there's things that are being referenced and it's from something else, like, get a little blocked on like, well, this is just a thing from something else and I don't know what it means. I always think back to the original Star Wars movie, all the ways in which this like history was hinted at, and I think everybody loves it. Like, everybody loves that was so rich and that connected people. Where Obi-Wan said, or old Ben Kenobi, excuse me, is like, I fought with your father in the Clone Wars, and it's like, what the hell were the Clone Wars? Like, we don't know. And the scene around the conference room on the Death Star, and it's like, well, the Imperial Senate won't stand for this, and then the character comes in and goes, the Imperial Senate's not our concern. It just got dismantled. And it's like, oh wow, what was the Imperial Senate? Like, what was that? And now we can picture the Imperial Senate. Now we've got 7 seasons in a movie and a decanonized miniseries plus comic books or whatever, all about the Clone Wars. So like, we know what these things are now. And so what I think could be read as just like, that's a thing that existed in this wider world. And this is a blessing and a curse of how Filoni does this. It ends up feeling like, well, this is just referencing, something else. And so, I want to bring in, where did I put it? I put it on this document to sort of add to this. There's I think one of the best, even though I strongly disagree with him here, cultural and political critics who has a regular op-ed in the New York Times and is a podcaster and writer in his own right, Jamel Bowie, who had spent part of his weekend on Threads just talking about how much he didn't like Ahsoka. And when he wasn't talking about how much he didn't like term limits. And there was some other thing. It was like these are 3 very disparate things that he was getting into. This was one of them. And so sort of his initial kind of launch on this was the basic problem, I'm quoting him here, the basic problem with most of the recent Star Wars output, with Andor as the notable exception, is that it feels as if it were written by people whose only reference point was other Star Wars material. It's not using Star Wars as a setting to riff on other genres and ideas. It is Star Wars as a genre on its own. And truth be told, that is incredibly boring. And the way we've talked about it, and if you go and read Jen's reviews, which you should, and she referenced it, I mean, this is Tolkien, this is Lewis, this is Miyazaki, this is Kurosawa. There's all these references that are clearly in there. But I think that if you watch it and you're like, I know this is all referencing some other Star Wars show, you are like writing off all of it because you're just like, I don't know, like, yeah, I guess that's all animated BS.
I think a great example of that is how people reacted to the history of Ahsoka and Sabine and her family getting wiped out on Mandalore. Because I think most people assumed that was something that appeared in another thing. And
Mm.
a bunch of the people who knew that, like, no, I've never heard about that either. Right. So I think there is something to be said for, like, if we are primed for, and I really love blaming the MCU for things in my reviews, but I do really feel like we have, as viewers and fans of genre storytelling, we are now so primed to be like, well, this must be referencing someone else, something else. This must be connecting to something else. We're just like assuming that's always happening, and just we are in different people are in different levels of in the know about it. That then we I think are much more likely to write off something that is actually just part of this. It's telling us the story as we go. And yeah, so that's a problem, because I think a lot of great shows, and or I think would be one of them, has so much storytelling in passing, right? Like, it's like we learn things about the
Mm.
characters as they're talking to each other about something else, right? And I feel like if we can't do that anymore, because everyone's going to be like, well, this must be from something else because I don't understand it, and then like not really pay attention to it because of that, that's a big problem for everyone.
And I think I'm not going to read his whole quote. Sorry, he got enough airtime on our podcast. But I had another Bowie quote later, which was about this sort of idea that, like, these audiences are now trained to accumulate the lore instead of follows narratives and stories and think about characters. And his argument was, so there were no narratives and there was no story and the characters were meaningless in this because it was just a lore delivery device across 8 episodes. And I don't agree about the show, but I do think that he's right. And is echoing Jen's point that there are people who just sort of fill out their wiki pages in their minds when they watch something where they're like, oh yes, now we know, like, that character actually did this, and at this time this is where this person was. Now I know what the timeline is. That's good. It's good. And now, oh, I see the hint of what's going to come later. Excellent. Like, I'll start a stub for the next entry for this other story, and we'll get to that later. And you can miss this, the narrative character, the richness of an actual story. But I think that, like, in the way that those people are missing the story, there's also people who wanted the story who missed it because they lost it in the fog of references and lore. That if you were watching, this was not connected to Star Wars, and you watch this story, I think a lot more people would have got the through lines because they wouldn't be thinking about what came before. If it was more like 1977, not even A New Hope yet, Star Wars, then you would just be like, yeah, I guess that lady, her family died. Okay, now I know that. That must be why she was acting so mean earlier. And they wouldn't think like, oh, I gotta watch 5 seasons of a cartoon to know this. So yeah, I don't know how Star Wars gets around it, and I don't know how Filoni in particular gets around it when that's sort of his MO. Maybe it's just a curse that he can't. I keep using blessing and curse, but maybe that's just an anchor that's going to weigh him down with the way he tells.
Do you feel like this series is, and obviously we it's dangerous to speculate about, in general, speculation is great for me, but it's dangerous to speculate about an author's intent, of course, right? So that's an asterisk next to what I'm about to say. But do we feel like this series is a product of Filoni being like, I don't care about that anymore, I'm just going to tell the story I want to tell? Or is it the opposite? Because I genuinely am undecided. Like, or is it the opposite where it's like, we're going to try to please lots of different types of audiences so everyone can kind of engage with this differently? Like, I have the throwbacks in here, and I'm reusing things from other stories like Rebels. We're continuing the plotline of Rebels, but we also need to make this show so that people who haven't watched all that can still enjoy it. Or is it more like he's just like, you know what? Like, this is the story I want to tell. If you're along for the ride, if you feel confused, go watch those other shows. You know what I mean? Like, I genuinely can't tell what this series tells us about the approach.
Bringing up authorial intent in the rhetorical situation. Look at that. Very nicely done. It's a really good question. I was thinking about, my mind was still on Harry Potter, and there was a certain point, maybe the 6th movie, where they were like, let's stop pretending we're bringing along new fans of this, and let's just talk to like people who know these movies and have read these books, because it's just too complicated to do that. And I feel like in some ways Filoni has crossed that line here. But what's nagging at me is, I was out hanging with my bros at a strip club. I mean, I was around the D&D table with my nerd friends, and we were talking about this. And there's a woman, it's an academics D&D group, and there's a woman who is a psychology professor and would not count herself in the legion of Star Wars fans. She was the only one of us watching this show and having not seen the cartoons. And she was more enthusiastic than the rest of us. So every pronouncement I want to say where like, oh, this is only talking to nerds, I think of Lindsay is her name. And I was like, Lindsay would like be kicking my ass right now and saying like, no way, dude, like this was so good for me. And it was very much the opposite. And in particular in that regard, Thrawn had a lot of baggage for me showing up, and Thrawn had the rest of the Star Wars nerds around the tables like, you just wait, like this is gonna be awesome. And Steph, who's in the D&D group too, is just like the biggest Thrawn fan in the world. And like Lindsay's just like, okay, I'll learn about this guy. Seems cool. Like, let's see what he's about. And had no expectations and just loved it all the more. So I dodged a lot of that question, but I don't think Dave thinks about Star Wars fans barely, like nearly as much as we all think he does. I think Dave is a storyteller, and he's going to work hard to tell a good story. And I'm going to bridge that into my other answer to the question of how far can Star Wars push it. Here's what I think Dave Filoni learned from George Lucas. George Lucas found Star Wars as a way to take a myth and tell some truths to the children of this generation that needed to hear it. Remember 1977, everything is a mess. The sides are unclear. Vietnam has ruined everything about any kind of cohesive story. And he said, look, we got good guys. We call them light side. We've got bad guys. We call them dark side. Let's make it simplistic. Let's tell simple stories. That was what the children of 1977 through 1983 needed. And then when he came back in the 90s, he's like, hey, guess what? Society could very easily turn to fascism. Spoiler, he was right. And so why don't I tell you a myth about how heroes become fascists? And let's talk about how that happens. Here's a totally different myth that the children need right now. And I think Dave Filoni's main goal is to tell us myths that we need right now. And we need to understand the relationship between teachers and students. We need to understand this cycle of violence that Balin wants to break, right? And so to me, if Star Wars is going to be effective, all the bells and whistles, yeah, I want to see a TIE fighter. Yeah, I want to see a lightsaber. I want to see all these things. But like, if you're not telling me a myth that speaks to what this new generation needs, then get out of my Star Wars, right? And I think the sequel trilogy struggled in that regard, because I think some parts of the sequel trilogy felt like it was what Jamel Bowie was describing, which is people saying, you like Star Wars? Here's some Star Wars in your Star Wars. And it just didn't always kind of cohere and didn't have something to say. The Last Jedi being the notable exception. So
I think if we think about all the New Republic threads, which I feel like got the least attention or seem like they're the least exciting or important if you read other people's reviews and stuff like that, even amongst people who really like the show. But that is a narrative about complacency. And I guess I would pair that with Marva's speech at the end of Andor too, right? Of like this happens because we're all asleep and we're all like in denial about what's happening. And so I feel like that's very apt in terms of like the way people approach doom scrolling and stuff like that today. You know what I mean? Like, so I really like that idea that it's like speaking to the now. And also like, now that you said that, I'm thinking I can see so many different things that could possibly fulfill that role, which is amazing. So I guess
let's pause and drop in Marva's speech.
Yeah.
Oh, that was really excellent. That was so good. That was so good. Just hearing it again.
Got it.
I can't believe you found the edit with the F-bomb still in there. That was great. I'm glad you uncovered that one. Is this a spot where I want to riff just slightly on the New Republic like scenes?
I'll go for it.
So this is outside of all of the things that we're talking about of like, but like a critique of a question I have outside of the narrative for both the last season of The Mandalorian and this, which, they were developed separately, I know, but, are conjunction in the same kind of story universe. Is it bad to have this like recurring underlying theme of, the democracy actually is just as bad as the fascist empire in again the year of our maker 2023. I don't think that they mean for it to be that. I think it's more like, well, we know the New Republic has to make a bunch of mistakes because we've already made these movies that say that they do, and so they're just trying to build it up and make it better. But I do not like that a lot of people are just like, you know what? I think the New Republic is worse than the Empire. Like, I actually hate them because they're complacent and they're doing it wrong. And like, I don't think that they're misinterpreting the story. I don't think this is an intentional thing, but there's something very awkward about like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have this like popular narrative when we're talking about the myths we need be that like, I guess the democracy kind of sucked. We could get rid of that. This could be bad. Related, one, I tried to slide a question in. It didn't really fit, and I'm glad that we moved on. But my sort of like, what are your hot takes within the story that are not part of the discourse? But I do want to put it in here now anyway. Is Senator Ziono wrong? Like, is he actually wrong? Like, he's clearly like an antagonist. We don't like him because he's in the way of our heroes. And people are like, he might be working with Thrawn, or he's working with the remnants, or he's part of the First Order maybe. And if you haven't watched Resistance, you don't know he's just a big old jerk. And he doesn't have any, he has no like ill political intent. He just is a bad person who doesn't know how to like handle power. But like, I don't, there's a general who goes off and like gets people killed, disobeying direct orders. I don't think civilian oversight's a bad thing for our military. And maybe we shouldn't necessarily jump so quickly to just because he hates droids and is a jerk. He's wrong in this situation. Even if I love Hera, and I think that Hera was doing the right thing in the end, I just don't know if Ziono was ultimately wrong. That's my hot take.
Now I'm like, does Hera represent American exceptionalism?
It's
a whole thing.
It did affect me. It did affect me that I went to see a screening of Dr. Strangelove while this show was airing, and I was like, "What's the difference between General Ripper and Hera?" In from the perspective of Senator Ziono, and I don't know what the answer is.
I mean, I think the answer is because she's actually right.
Sure.
I think it changes if Thrawn is not actually a threat, right? You know what I mean? Like, which is hard. I don't know, it's hard, but
submit to military rule and get rid of democracy. I get it. Okay, Star Wars is great.
No.
Sorry, it's not all that different from Poe in Last Jedi, really, right? Like, Poe was wrong. Poe's long shot plan didn't work, so we ignore that. But I mean, Hera's in the exact same spot.
I think it's really bumping up against, can a rebellion continue to be a rebellion after it's no longer quote unquote necessary? And I feel like that's a lot of the conflict in the show, is that everyone's like, oh, like, you're living in the past, Hera. Like, the war is over. But it's not. So it's like, I do think it's interesting. And I do think that a lot of Hera's storyline in the series is that idea of like, what it's sort of like, this is going to be a really weird reference, but in White Christmas, one of the big songs in White Christmas is "What Do You Do with the General When He Stops Being a General?" And I feel like that's sort of what this is, except at the end of the day, she is right. So it's like,
so dear Jamel Bowie of the New York Times, if you think there's no references to anything else, White Christmas implanted in Ahsoka. I will say, I'll try to pull us out of this tangent that I created and get us back onto the document.
No, wait. I want in on the tangent. Don't close the tangent.
Go ahead.
Before his sins in the What is the Scuttlebutt song, Lin-Manuel Miranda taught us, winning is easy, young man, governing's harder.
Oh, right.
And I think that's what they're going for. Democracy is messy. Now, PT is exactly right. Damn it. Why again? Where, the show is accidentally playing with fire here. The message has to be democracy is difficult, but worth it. And we haven't seen the worth it part yet. We haven't seen what freedom looks like on these planets. And that's troublesome. I think of it as they are showing us that that principles and philosophy have to meet the practical at a certain point. And the New Republic is governing on the principles. And this might not be a nice thing to say. It reminds me of Occupy Wall Street, where it was like, here's a great idea. Let's talk truth to power. Let's talk about these businesses and how awful it is. Oh, but wait, like we can't have anybody with a megaphone, so we're going to have everybody have equal floor time, which means the 200 people who want to talk each get 6 seconds to make their. And it was like, yes, like the principle of equality and absolute fairness is so admirable, but like you also just need somebody to talk in a megaphone or whatever it is. So I feel like the New Republic is so great right now. Mon Mothma, let's get rid of the navies. This is intertextual. It's not in the show. Let's get rid of the navies. Let's not have a single figure who can be chancellor. Let's not do all this. But it's going to take some practical bets. All right. Now I've gotten in on the tangent. Close the tangent, PT.
Yeah, no, it's great because nothing that you did is going to stop me from making this movement out, which is I think that part of the issues that we're kind of bumping up against, and I'm being a little glib in defending Senator Ziono, but this sort of how are they portraying the New Republic and what does that mean is somewhat boxed in by the fact that the sequel trilogy exists. And one of the people who made the sequel trilogy, J.J. Abrams, was very against the idea of ever talking about politics in those movies because that was one of the big knocks at the time against the prequels was like, oh my God, there were scenes about space politics. The Crawl talked about trade routes and taxation plans. Like, this is insane. We can't ever do that. And so we have these inevitabilities of the democracy fails, the New Republic fails, and doesn't get its big, it doesn't understand the big nemesis that's out there or the big threat. And the people who are clinging to, but even though the war's over, it's not really over. And actually I'm still fighting it. And we got to make sure to keep doing that. We're proven right. And so, that's this sort of weird place that they're in. And so I think that you're right, Greg, which is, the action has to be there. We have to execute these principles. And on some level, we know they never do. Or at least if they do, like maybe we'll see it and then that will make the destruction of the New Republic even more tragic. But, we're sort of set up to, see, oh, this is going to sort of rot from the inside or at least fall apart because of the negligence. It's all very Weimar Republic, in between the two world wars of like, oh, we're going to be fine. Like, we'll figure this out. Like, this is going to be great. And then, the problems rise again from within. But, right now it's not 100% coming through because, maybe it's because the heroes are inevitably rebellion and military based. And maybe there's just a part of me that's like, what if like the Senate was actually good now? What if they knew what they were doing? Like, could that happen? And that hasn't come through yet. But I don't know. We'll see. I believe in Mon Mothma. I'd vote for her for another term.
I think this also speaks to a fundamental tension in modern cinema of we can espouse democracy as an ideology, but at the same time, all of our movies support rugged individualism, which is sort of like, which in American history are weirdly paired with each other, but also at odds with each other. And so I feel like, I'm thinking about all our conversations about Mission Impossible, where it's like, Ethan Hunt can act as like a rogue agent and it's fine. We support him, even though probably in our real world, he would be sanctioned and like put in jail right, for the things that he does. So yeah, I think sorry, I think I pulled us back into the tangent by accident, but I feel like that's not just a problem of Star Wars, is my point.
What I'll say is the way I thought that was getting us out of the tangent was thinking about the sort of problems of this show existing within an ever-growing and ever more crowded timeline between episode 1 and episode 9, and particularly between episode 6 and episode 7, after the original trilogy and before the new one, where, there's 25 years that we've not explored, maybe 20 to 25 years that haven't been documented yet, but still there's a lot there. And I think that the reality of like, that I think people know going into this show, which is, okay, there's been 4 seasons of TV already about this, plus there's all these movies, plus they've announced they're building up to another movie with another series first that comes in, and we don't know how many seasons Skeleton Crew will have, we don't know how many seasons Ahsoka will have, and Jon Favreau's like, The Mandalorian will continue after the Filoni movie. I'll do it forever. And so it's just like all of this, I think, plays into how hard it is to sort of just try to enjoy and understand this story on its own, because it exists in this wider context, and because it does, without, there's no denying, it is setting up like what's going to happen next season, next time on Star Wars. Like, these things are going to happen. And so I do understand the people that watch it and are just sort of like, great, this is just like another middle part of a story that will never end, and I'm not satisfied by the fact that it's all just callbacks and call forwards or foreshadowing for what may come later.
So yeah, that was a big question that I wanted to ask and potentially end with. We'll see. What does the series, and where we end the series specifically, what does it tell us about what's next, and what sort of does it alter about our understanding about the future of Star Wars? And so, on this podcast before, last time we had, I think, our Star Wars Day episode, we sort of checked in about like, okay, well, all these films have been announced, like, and then there's the Mandoverse, and we're working towards a movie. What could that be, right? And we have another huge data entry point now with this series. And so, like, in general, we can kind of pick up on that question wherever we feel like we want to. But what does this tell us about the future of Star Wars?
It's over. This is it. We're done. Check.
Good job,
everybody.
I realized a long time ago Star Wars is going to far outlive me, and there's no doubt about it kind of churning forever, I think, at this point. So I think we just have to all acknowledge, and I am not talking to the two of you, I'm talking to the Star Wars fan community, that like it's gonna keep growing, and some of it's gonna be great, and some of it's gonna be bad, and some will be your favorite, and some will be not for you, and we just have to accept that you're no longer just a fan of all of it. I really had fun writing that blog post. Every time I saw it passed around by one of my buddies, somebody responded like, I guess it's good they said that, but like, I love it all. And, I know a lot of us feel that way. We love Star Wars. We're like all in there, but it's like, you all have to be honest with yourselves and say there's some you like and some you don't like, right? I have yet to meet the guy
some you
with
like
the Rise
more.
of Skywalker. Yeah, exactly, right. So the future of Star Wars, I think, between this show and what we've heard announced, it's gotta go far away to new places. And including PT's comments just now that like it's boxed in by the sequel trilogy. So how much can really happen? Well, a lot could happen on this planet in another galaxy that just is irrelevant. And I don't think we're gonna stay here forever, but it could happen, and it could just be that Ahsoka and Sabine are out here now and live a fantasy Lord of the Rings life and see what happens. And then the James Mangold movie, it's like, let's go a really long time ago and do that. What was interesting is they asked the question of how old is Hu Yang, and it would have been such an easy way to be like 25,000 years old.
Right.
I was turned on by Jedi Blink Block the Gleep Glorp and on the planet Tython. And they didn't do that. So I think they are kind of keeping their powder dry to keep things really kind of separate. And I think that's the smart move. So let's put the Ray movie at one end of the timeline. Let's throw the Mangold movie way over there. Hey, this Hey Republic thing is working really well in publishing. Let's throw the Acolyte there, which is the project I'm most excited for, and the one like nobody's talking about right now. And it's just a function of where we're at in the cycle on that show. I think Dave and John will continue to have kind of ownership, quote unquote, of the Return of the Jedi to Force Awakens time period. And I think that's great. That's yours. We'll kind of keep publishing out of here. When the High Republic ends, I think they'll see the success of it, and they'll pick a different time period and say, let's go make 20 books at this time period. And the comics are just now getting to Return of the Jedi. And so I think they'll take the 5 years from Return of the Jedi to Mando, and they'll make a meal out of that for a really long time. Like, there's so much story to tell there, and so much good work comics could do to fill in how we go from Endor to Jakku and figure out the end of the war. So it's going to be everywhere on this timeline, and to me that's the healthiest move. I don't know if what I
Yeah.
just said is what I really think should happen or what I'm saying will happen, but I think that's what this franchise needs right now, is just to get weird. And I hate to say it, but Star Trek did it really well the last few years. Like, let's just go crazy and give everybody some of everything. If there's not like one sequel trilogy that has to have all our hopes and dreams, then you can't hate all of Star Wars at once. And then you buy theme park tickets and you buy, action figures and so on.
Yeah, there's merch for everybody.
There is. I will say to one of the earlier points of what Greg was just saying, but I think encapsulating a lot of what he was talking about, the idea of it helped to read a bunch of the books and get involved in the comics wasn't because, then you'll know who Thrawn is, or you'll have followed the X-Wing Squadron. You would have picked up on Corran Horn in the Obi-Wan show. It was to be disappointed in bad Star Wars long before anything was released in the theaters or on TV that might disappoint you. Because you're just sort of like, this book wasn't very good in 1994 or 95, and be like, I don't really like Kevin J. Anderson's approach to what Luke was doing. I'm not into it. And so, that idea of having to let go of, I love all of Star Wars, and just be like, okay, there's going to be some Star Wars I don't like, in a way for me makes it easier to accept, especially when it's something major like a movie or a TV show, except for The Rise of Skywalker, as look at all the things that are good. And there's a lot of things that I actually do like about this. I can enjoy that even though I recognize all the flaws.
I think that they're leaving it open so that the James Mangold movie could, in theory, connect with whatever's going to end up happening on Peridia, but it doesn't have to. And so I like that idea, because and I think what I would hope that they would settle on is that everything makes sense together, but it's not necessarily doing the direct referencing, right? Where it's not like I don't know if I want Hu Yang to show up in the James Mangold movie. I mean, I'd be happy to see him in general, but I don't know if I need that level of hey, it's all part of the same thing, but to sort of be able to draw a line from, here's how the Force began, right? Here were the first Jedi, drawing that line and being like, well, that makes sense if we could follow the timeline all the way over here, right? And so I think it's exciting that it can all fit together in one big puzzle, but the puzzle pieces don't necessarily have to be speaking directly to each other. Mm-hmm. Does this change anything about what's going to happen with the Mandoverse movie? Because that, in theory, is the next big sort of tent pole that we're working towards, right?
I mean, they haven't really clarified what the order in which the movies would come out, but it always made the most sense that the Filoni movie would come out first, unless they realize or there's an impact because there's been this delay because of the strikes, that they're like, okay, we actually need another year or two to get the seasons out before the story that we're going to tell in the movie is ready to be told. We have an opening. Can we do one of the other stories first? But yeah, I mean, I think, I agree with you, Jen, that I think it would be a problem. I think it would be bad for Star Wars if it felt like, we're going back in time 25,000 years, but it's the same enemies. Or, the Lord Squads are here. Hu Yang is here. Everything that you could recognize is here. And, I do think that, one of the problems at a, I don't know, I don't want to say studio level, because so many people are ready to just sort of personify Lucasfilm as Kathleen Kennedy and therefore as evil. But I think that there is a sort of business side issue of, what do people want from Star Wars? What's the iconography? What's going to get people in the theaters or subscribing to Disney Plus? And if they're, historically, it's we need stormtroopers, we need Darth Vader, we need lightsabers, we need spaceships, particularly these spaceships. And, now that we're in the Mandoverse show, it's we need the Mandalorian, we need Grogu, we need this ship and that ship, and maybe this person, and Boba Fett for the people who grew up in the 70s and 80s. And, we'll do all of that. And, that could be cool and could be interesting. But as I think we're all saying, we want stories that aren't just the stories again. And so, yeah, I like the idea when Greg said, what if Ahsoka and Sabine are just forever or for decades in this other galaxy, having a fantasy story, questing around Peridia? that sounds wonderful. That sounds amazing. Like, I love that. Or they get their ship fixed and they're doing like a No Man's Sky planet to planet exploration of just like mapping a whole new galaxy. Star Trekking in its own way. Like, that would be amazing too. But like, I don't know if the budget is there for that show, like without a sort of promise of, and we're eventually going to get back to Luke Skywalker's going to show up at some point. Like, that's what like they think people want, and they need that. And there's a part of me that wants Luke Skywalker to show up in a Thrawn movie. Like, that would be amazing. But I also want these other random stories. So yeah, I don't know how it all like this sort of push pull affects what we've got. I like that this show opened the door to a lot of other things, and I hope that the door doesn't just become another small playpen that like, oh, and like we have this new prettiest stuff. The prettiest stuff will now be in 10 other Star Wars properties over the course of the next 4 years. And it will just start to feel like a slightly bigger cage than the original trilogy cage, which became the original and prequel cage, and is now the prequels, original, and Mando cage. And, I want it to be out of the cage and out and doing different things.
I feel like even if we don't get as much Mortis as we think we are going to get, the idea behind Mortis in the Clone Wars was, hey, wasn't that weird? We went to that weird place and then we came back, right? Like, what happened? Were we dreaming? Like, what happened? And so I feel like...
Did you die and come back to life? Like, I think I did.
So I feel like a lot of stuff could happen there. Like, I think it's very smart, actually, that we set up another galaxy, because a lot can happen there with very little consequence or ripple effect in Galaxy Prime, right? We could even completely destroy Perdia, and it would be fine, probably. Like, as long as, like, Ahsoka's not there when it happens. Yeah, but Jesus. Like, you know what I mean? Like, anyway,
death to the Noti.
I just that's true. No, we take them they'd be like porgs. They get on the ship and they go.
Okay.
They'd ride a Purgle. That's
so for those paying attention, we have 2 shirts coming to the Long Take Review merch shop. There's PT's Giono wasn't wrong design and Jen's Death to the Noti image.
No,
it's getting dark. I don't know that we're gonna sell many.
And Greg, yours is not my Star Wars. Like, that's it. Like, my Star Wars. Not my Star Wars. Yeah.
But on the back it says, like, I swear I mean this in a positive way and I'm not a toxic person. Let's
reappropriate not my Star Wars. So I just realized I should have done this a lot earlier, but I put out a poll on Instagram earlier today saying that we were going to be recording an episode, and I just wanted to do a quick lightning round of answering, because there are only like 4 of them or 5 of them. So Frank, Mr. Daffron, says, I remain curious about the relevance of orange lightsabers. And the Wampus Lair asked, what is Baylan after? And I feel like those are 2 very related questions. So, like, do we have theories? This is speculation, crazy zone. Or safe zone? What do you think we're going to continue, regardless of what happens with Ray Stevenson's recasting or whatever? Like, what do we think, based on what we have right now, what do we think we're going to continue to learn about Baylan and Shin? And the whole Perdia thing, like, and the Mortis gods, we can fold all that in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know is obviously the correct answer, but because we're doing irresponsible speculation, is the fact that the episode ended, or the final sort of montage of things was Baylan standing on the outstretched hand of the statue that we, as hardcore nerds, knew was the father from the Mortis gods, but I will pull from the non-Clone Wars watching Jasmine, who was like, oh, why is he on a statue of himself? Like, why is there a statue of him here? Is he immortal? Like, she had all these sort of things that were spitting out of like, oh, he's found that like he is coming back to some realm that he was in. And that was interesting. I kind of feel like that is what he wants, is to be, there's like the dark side, the light side is what's been fighting all along. He wants to be that power over them. He wants to be, and the whole thing we've talked about Master and Apprentice, we haven't quite made the leap, but I think, that myth that Greg was talking about that we need is also the sort of generational handoffs, and the sort of, you come from this line of wacky Jedi that have gone off and done different things. It's the generation to generation, and that includes the generations, or at least the hint of the generation of the father and the son and daughter, that I think he wants to take over the father of like, okay, I'm going to be That's the power. I'm the ultimate like decider of what's going on. Y'all are just fighting back and forth, and this is a waste of everybody's time. All that's happening is people are getting hurt, but like I don't want to be on one side or the other of that. I want to be the next level above. I want to be the like older generation that runs things. So I think that's what he's looking for. I don't know how that makes it orange, apart from I think it was supposed to be like, oh, bad guy. Wait a minute. Are we sure?
Right.
And that it was just sort of like
Not quite red.
Yeah, it hadn't quite gotten red, and that gives a little pause of what exactly is going on with him.
Sorry, I wasn't really listening. I was mourning the fact that my question didn't make the cut for this episode.
I was going to ask that next,
which hurts. It cuts me deep. I think PT largely covered it. I think they couldn't do red because it would just have to mean Sith, and I have a lot of questions. The Kyber mythology seems to just come and go based on story convenience, and it bothers me a little bit. And House of R talked about this a lot this week too. It's like, oh, so if we can build a whole plot around finding a Kyber, let's do that. But then if you just need one, it's just there. So the idea that red lightsabers come from bled Kyber is kind of interesting to me. It kind of tortured, like you have to feed your anger and aggression into a crystal. So orange might be on the path to that. But I think most importantly, orange just represented not Sith.
Yeah.
Balin breaking the wheel. I like PT's comments on that as well. To be able to control the spinning of the galaxy in certain ways and get behind that. It does feel like there's no way that succeeds. And in some ways, how I interpreted Mortis, and this is, again, as I said, one viewing like a decade ago, I interpreted it as confirmation that there was such a thing as bringing balance to the Force, and that it was thrown out of balance at that moment, and everything that happened in our galaxy prime, as Jen called it, was because of Mortis being broken. So to put Balin back in the realm of the Father, that feels to me like getting the Force back in balance. And then you run into sequel trilogy problems. And then you run into Anakin tells us in The Rise of Skywalker, which really was the beginning of the Hayden Sans, technically, I guess. He came in and did a day's voiceover, or 10 minutes of voiceover, where he said, bring balance as I once did, as one of the voices that Rey hears while she's laying on the ground on Exegol. I just feel dirty saying these words. And so when, so I think canonically, and this is a whole other can of worms, that the galaxy was brought into balance by Anakin. So I suspect if Balin gets there, I don't know if that means the Father has come back in some form, or if Balin becomes the new Father, and as somebody who's tinged with darkness as the Father, that's what slides it out of balance. And I don't feel bad rambling and saying all of that, because these are the things Dave Filoni thinks about, even if we don't. So,
well, also in that Mortis arc in Clone Wars, the Father is testing Anakin as the chosen one to see if he can take his place. So I feel like if that's an easy way to make Hayden a permanent fixture in the show, and just not just a Force ghost that pops in every once in a while, right? And actually be like, oh wait, no, like you were looking for your master the whole time. Here he is. He's the Father. And I mean, I've been wrong before, but every time I come up with something like that, I'm like, but that's too weird. That's too deep.
Yeah.
That's
people would hate that.
But at
Normies.
the same time, I don't know. I've been proven wrong before. So Greg's question, when I pulled this, and I was like, Greg, you're going to be on the podcast. Like, you don't need to send me the question.
I will note the only reason I didn't send a question is because I was being, master apprentice style, conferencing with students all day before I had a meeting. I never looked at Instagram, so I didn't even know this happened. But I would have submitted a question
also.
Yeah, for sure.
I tried to fit in first time caller, long time co-host, but it didn't fit in the question box.
It's okay. I mean, your question was pretty long. It's, do you think the blade of Talzin is still there, or did it disappear when Morgan passed? And so I'll take the answer to this first, because this question kind of broke me, because I assumed Ahsoka still had the Sword of Talzin, and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool and weird. Like, what is she gonna do with it? Because she's down because to me during their fight, she was down a lightsaber, and then she gained the sword. So I was like, oh, cool. Maybe she's just gonna be like half Sword of Talzin, half lightsaber now. That sounds great, at least for a little while. But then this idea of it disappearing or being left there, I was like, well, let me go back. And I rewound the tape and I was like, she's not holding it when she runs away and jumps off the cliff. So I think because Mother Talzin's thing was that she could summon the sword at will, right? That was her whole with the magic. So like, I feel like if it probably disappeared and then we'll get summoned by somebody else later. I don't know.
I mean, I wonder if it even would have. I mean, I guess if Morgan had lived, she would be able to sort of keep it. But without Morgan alive, when the Night Sisters left the galaxy, I kind of feel like could it continue? Like the magic's gone. Like all the people who hold it, it could have just disappeared. But yeah, apparently that was not an important piece of information to show. But maybe that's leaving it open-ended, where what if Filoni's like, maybe I want her to have the Blade of Talzin. That could be in her little closet with the Anakin videos and the training orbs.
It's just hanging there.
I want to, if we're still in irresponsible speculation territory, I'm going to jump back briefly. It isn't explained why Ezra can build a lightsaber, and it is kind of, we're hand-waving away or trying to make a headcanon out of it. My take on it is there was like a moment in the scene where they were like, Ahsoka was going to say, when I left the world between worlds and I went back to the place where I was fighting Vader, Malachor, right? The name of that planet. I picked up your old broken lightsaber and I've had your kyber crystal. Here you go. It's presented back. And then it was like, nice. This is going to make no sense to the people who haven't watched the animated shows. What a crazy thing to try to explain. Let's just cut to him building the lightsaber. And we're just going to do that. Based on absolutely nothing, but that's my headcanon of what happened until I am told otherwise.
I like it.
To some of our earlier points, think of how we want to explain that and figure it out. Whereas, like, the end of Return of the Jedi, Luke throws away his lightsaber. It's so important, so meaningful. And then, like, it's just on his belt later. And we're like, cool, he still got it. Don't worry about it.
Right.
And it's like, we didn't need any answers back then, but now we need, like, but tell me.
Now everything has to make sense. Yeah.
All I want to add to the Blade of Talzin is, hey, Ahsoka fights with two lightsabers and she lost one of them. Wouldn't it be awesome if she now fought with a green fire sword too?
Right?
Yeah,
that would 100%. Be really awesome. That's all I want.
So she might have pocketed it. Like, I don't know. Like,
yeah,
it's not visible when she's
put it
running.
in a Leku, like she just kind of like had a little tiny space.
Or this is really going off the deep end, and so we'll move on after this. Or somehow during her time in Peridea, she learns how to use magic like Night Sisters, but in like for good. And then she can summon the sword again because she's held it or something.
Think of how like annoyed people were that suddenly Sabine was training as a Jedi, and imagine that transferred to suddenly Ahsoka can just learn to be a Night Sister. I do want to throw out, I was very against the idea of Sabine having the Force. I was like, great, she's training as a Jedi, but she can't access the Force. That's really interesting. That's cool. Don't let her actually pull a thing by the end of the show, until it was happening. And I was like, this is awesome. I love it. Thank you. This is the closest we're going to get to Rey Nobody being canon again in its own like twisted way. Anyone can use the Force. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, George. It's not like some weird eugenics thing that you have to have the right kind of blood. You just got to try real hard and you're able to access the universe
or be about to die. That's the other thing.
Sure. Yeah, or face mortal threat, or your friends face mortal threats.
Back to Jen's theory, the secret of the finale title is that all three were Ahsoka. Ahsoka is the Jedi, the witch, and the warlord.
Yes.
That's what's coming.
But Ezra is still Jesus. That's what's important.
That just I'm gonna have to think about that more later. That blew my mind. Okay, so another question is, and we only have two more. Another question is from my friend Erica, and she says, "This is a really good question. How would we feel about the finale if Filoni / the actors could have done interviews throughout the series?"
Oh, oof. That's interesting.
Is that a good question?
It is.
That's a very good question.
My initial shooting from the hip reaction is the disappointment about what happened with Baylan and Shin would have been amped up 30 to 40%. Because there would have been a lot of like, we hope that we did Ray the best. Like his work was so strong that would have been building all season. Everyone would have been like, oh my God, like what's gonna happen? Like what's gonna happen here? And then it still would have just been like, they're there at the end, whatever. And folks would have been like, there would have been even more hype for what was gonna happen with Baylan and Shin. And not because they're trying to fake hype, but because they're trying to honor him and what, his loss and what he had done. And I think that it would have made all of that even worse.
Right. Also, probably good that we didn't force the cast and crew to sort of parade their grief around on a press tour.
Good point. I assume there's a gallery episode coming. They did release that little hint that they have, lots of interviews with Rosario and some with Hayden. Like they were collecting the material as they went. So hopefully the gallery episode can rectify some of this. But honoring the spirit of the question, but not actually answering it, it just makes me so sad. I support SAG-AFTRA. I want a good deal, but like, Natasha's not a huge star who plays Sabine. Like she deserves her victory lap of being out here and sharing these. And I forget the name of the actress, forgive me, who plays Shin Hati, but hasn't had a lot of major roles. Mary Elizabeth Winstead has been around a lot, has been around the block. She was in a big DC project. She, has a kind husband to cry to when she's sad about it. I don't feel as bad to her, but like these characters, like Rosario, I think played it exactly right, which is every Tuesday night, she put some beautifully political message up on her Instagram. And it was like, I know you're coming to look for this and look for what I think about whatever the Ahsoka and whatever the episode happened. So it was like, I'll use that power to make you think about indigenous rights or make you think about creative communities. I only think things get better when Dave talks about them, though. So if Dave could have been out and about, I think he would have had some good explanations. But I also don't know that he would have talked during the show. He tends to be pretty tight-lipped. And so I think what we'll see in an eventual gallery or whatever they'll call it this time around, I think we'll get it. But it might have helped a lot to have some of that goodwill kind of spread around.
And also, well, two things. One is next Star Wars Celebration. I'm sure they'll have more than ample opportunity to kind of like talk about the work that they did and sort of give us all those sort of behind the scenes things that we would have gotten had they been sort of touring. But the other thing I think is they could have probably prepared us better, with short of announcing that there's going to be a season 2 and when it's going to be. I feel like they probably could have primed people for the lack of resolution for certain storylines, right? Like obviously that's complicated because of Ray Stevenson, the Baylan story kind of hanging and not really like not giving us kind of enough information to go on for next season. But I feel like in terms of what the story was headed towards, like commentary could have helped sort of manage people's expectations, I think, a little bit without spoiling anything. But yeah, this is a great an alternative history to kind of contemplate, I think. And then finally, the Colby cast, Colby of the Colby cast asks, season 2 when?
Now, right now. Come on the show and just walk us through season 2. Just give us the pitch. We'll record for a few hours.
What's your best guess? Right, because we often on the show talk about the impact the writer's strike is going to have on release dates and stuff like that. What do you feel like is the most likely at this point, with the information we have, the most likely time a season 2 would come out?
We were walking through some of this on our text thread, trying to figure out exactly when things are happening. I think since then there was a round of news stories about some copyright filings that suggest Skeleton Crew is looking like January now, having previously been December. So if Skeleton Crew is the start of 2024 and they want to always start and end a show about halfway through the subscription month on Disney Plus, I think it's going to be Skeleton Crew. Then I think it's going to be The Acolyte. Then I would say this is wild speculation. Skeleton Crew, January to early March or February, somewhere in there. I would say The Acolyte over the summer. And I would say Mando 4 in the fall, because I suspect it was either mostly written or Favreau just went ahead and kept writing because it's just him alone in a
Wow.
room. Just like accusing him of being a scab with no evidence.
Yeah, I was
out of the
gonna
blue.
say,
sorry,
that's
sorry,
like,
John
this
Favreau. And so I would say the earliest I would get excited for, I'm going to call Star Wars Day 2025. I bet that could be the start, which that pains me because that's pretty far away.
And that's
Yeah.
sort of the Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's around when that premiered, right? It was May.
Ish, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that might be too optimistic because I think even if Jon Favreau had written all of season, I mean, he said he had written a bunch of season 4 even before season 3 ended, like before the strike.
Yeah.
So, but I feel like it takes 2 years from them from entering production to then getting that show up on the on our screens. So yeah, I feel like that they're going to stretch out the Skeleton Crew and Acolyte shows. I mean, they've got Bad Batch and they have some other, maybe another Visions, maybe
Andor
a Tales
2,
of the Jedi.
I forgot as well.
Oh yeah,
Andor
2,
Andor
which they are
season 2. Yeah.
Right, the best show that we all like the most. Let's forget that. But yeah, so I think that it's 2 years from now is the absolute earliest that Ahsoka could be, and honestly, I kind of feel like fall 2025 is going to be Mando, and then Ahsoka would be the following year. But maybe I'm wrong, and maybe they start to because they kind of built up a backlog. Maybe stuff starts to come out even faster. I don't know. But yeah, I would assume it's 2 years from now. 2 years to write, pre-production, film it, effects, post, all of that, and then get it ready and hyped up. But I would love to be wrong. I would love for it to be in the next calendar year. Secretly, they filmed all of it, including a bunch with Ray Stevenson. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Oh.
If they suddenly were like, "Psych, we filmed 16 episodes, but we broke it into 2 seasons."
I don't think they could have done that without anyone noticing.
Why would they have held that back?
They did it all during the strike because they're all scabs.
Yeah, they're all scabs.
I know. Greg, I was gonna cut that earlier part out and spare you people adding you, and now you just doubled down on it. So I don't know how to help you now. All right, let's wrap up. PT, I know we keep saying we're gonna do this at the beginning of the show, and then I keep forgetting. But where can folks follow the Long Take Review?
For those of you who listened all the way through, thank you so much. And why don't you reward yourself for your efforts by following us on Instagram and Threads at the Long Take Review? Or if there's no poll from Jen in which you can ask some questions, why don't you ask questions of us at the longtakereview@gmail.com. If you want us to do more TV shows, talk about Star Wars more. If there's other content-based things you want us to make sure never do this again. If there's any feedback you want to give us, please look for us in all of these places. We'll be glad to hear from you.
And Greg, where can folks find you?
Let's see. I am on Instagram and I am on Threads at EyeonCanon, EYEONCANON. And I will say we've already plugged my blog generously. Thank you to PT for doing so. And it's at eyeoncanon.com. There was a part of this episode where we talked about nostalgia, and I wrote a blog post like 3 years ago that is one of the very few I brought over from my letterpress or my WordPress over to my Substack, which was a talk about nostalgia and toxic nostalgia, and it used Don Draper's carousel pitch as its kind of foundational moment to talk about. And I really liked that when I wrote it, and I liked it enough to bring it over. So check it out, eyeoncanon.com, and you can find that there somewhere in the backlog.
Nice. And you can find me at Sobchakchai, SOPCHOCKCHAI, on Instagram and Threads, and Qui-Gon Jen on Letterboxd. The Disney Plus train has not slowed. Loki started the same week Ahsoka ended. That was rough for me. But I have a review up of the Loki season premiere, which was a lot of fun. So if you are watching that show, keep an eye out for my weekly reviews. Thanks, everybody. thank you for listening. You can follow The Long Take on Substack at thelongtake.substack.com. Subscribe for free to receive reviews of films with Oscar buzz, as well as new films and series from pop franchises like Star Wars and Marvel.
Why are we waving? Goodbye.
I don't know why I'm waving. It's a recording. I waved because I was on Zoom conferences all day. What an idiot.
Fair enough.
I also was waiting because usually I press stop too soon and then you say bye and I feel bad. So I was trying to give you a chance to say bye, and now it's now it's weird.
Now it's
okay.
weird.
Bye.
Put this in the beginning.